In this video, I'm going to show you how I refinished my fiberglass entry door. This is How To Bob, and I'm ready to get started. As you can see here, this door is sun faded, weather beaten, and in just bad shape overall. So we're going to have to take the door off the hinges just to make it a little easier. Now you could do this on the hinges, but this would make it a whole lot easier. So we're going to take a punch. We're going to take out the hinge pins. Should be 3 of them on the entry door from the inside of the door. Just tap the hinge pins up with a hammer and a punch, and then I'm going to use another chisel to pull the hinges all the way out. Make sure that they're all the way out, and then once they get loose, I can go ahead and pull them out by hand here. And once I get the third hinge pin removed, I can go ahead and unlock the door and open the door. But while I'm doing this, I'm going to be very careful because the door is going to slide off the hinges. They're going to come apart. I'm going to make sure that don't scratch the floor, the door doesn't fall. Make sure you hold on to it tight. I'm going to take my door over to some sawhorses that I have set up and set it down. And then I'm going to start by removing all the hardware. I have a brass kick plate on this door that I'm going to remove. I'll also want to remove the door knocker, the peephole, the doorknobs, and the deadbolt. Any of the extra hardware that's left on the door you want to remove so we can get down to just the door. Now you can see here I am removing the door knocker slash peephole, and I'm doing this from the inside of the door. This is the side that I'm not going to finish. I'm just doing this because all the screws are on the inside of the door, and I want to make sure that I don't scratch the door. So what I did is put some cardboard down on my sawhorses for when I flip it over onto the side that I'm not going to finish. And now I'm going to take the deadbolt off. Just take the 2 screws out here. That'll pull out of the door, and there's a sleeve on the other side. It's kind of like a protective sleeve. You can see I can take that off, and there's 2 pieces here. There's a protective sleeve. And last, I have the doorknob. Simply remove the 2 screws here on the inside of the door, and it will pull apart once I get the last screw out. Now with a fiberglass door, you have to be very careful on what kind of stripper you use because it could melt the fiberglass door. I found that this organic stripper works very well. You want to read the package, and you definitely want to use some gloves to keep the stripper off your hands. So if you're in question, ask around at a paint store, call the manufacturer, but I found that this organic stripper works very well, and it did not harm the door. So I'm going to get started stripping, and what I'm doing is just brushing on a fairly thick coat, and I have a plastic scraper. I'm not using a metal one because I'm worried about scratching the fiberglass door, and I want to make sure that I get all the surface stain and polyurethane off of the door. This door is textured, so some of the stain will remain in the indented areas, the wood grain areas, if you will, and that's okay because that'll give it a natural look. Once I restain, it'll just give those a little darker coloring. Once I get to the raised panel areas where the cracks and crevices are, I'll want to use my brush. I'm going to test it on a little area here. You can see that it does very easily remove the stain and polyurethane that's on there. Okay, I'm going to apply another coat of stripper because I want to make sure that I get all my stain and my old polyurethane off. And I'm going to use my plastic scraper. And here's a tip. If you don't have a plastic scraper, get one of these. It's a laminate sample from the hardware store. They're free in the kitchen department at most hardware stores, and they work good as a scraper or a spreader. I'm going to continue to scrape on this door, and I'll use my brush in the areas that are being stubborn. And I can also use my brush in the areas where the cracks are to get all the old stain and polyurethane. I want to make sure that I get down to the door so I have a good base for the new stain. Okay, now that I've got all the flat surfaces on my door stripped how I want them, I'm going to work on the corners. As you can see here, the stain kind of sticks in the corners, and to do that I'm going to use an old toothbrush. I'll work that around the corners and in the cracks just to get all the old stain out of those areas. Once I'm done with this, I'm going to get a damp rag and wipe the door down to get all the stripper off. And as you can see, there is still some stain left in the grain, which is okay. That'll give it a wood grain look when I go to refinish it. Now I'm going to use my tack cloth to wipe the door down. This gets any dust off. You can use an air compressor, but I still would recommend going over it with a tack cloth just to make sure you get any residue off of the door before you stain it. I'm going to be using a gel stain, and this is going to act a little different than it normally would on wood because it's not going to soak in like it would if you were on a wood door. This is going to lay on top, so my finished product has to look like wood grain. So I'm going to keep working it, and I'm going to use a foam brush and just keep going over it until I get the closest thing possible to a wood grain look. If I get something that's too dark, I'll just keep going over it and spreading that stain until I get the look that I wanted. Now you'll notice some darker spots where the etched wood grain is in this door, and that's just an advantage of the etched doors because it makes it look more natural, because in a wood door the wood grain is going to take the stain a little darker. And I think I've got this panel here pretty close to how I want it, and I'm going to go on to the next panel. And you want to go with the grain to make it look as natural as possible. So where the two panels look like they fit together, you want to just go with the grain, and then once you get it how you want, you can go to the other panel and cross over and just make a straight line to make it look like wood grain. Just go right across the other mark that you made from the last panel, and then you want to work in the corners. You can also use a brush for this if you have a little difficulty getting in the corners. I did grab a brush at some point and started working in the corners. You want to work away from the corners. It's best to work away from the corners because if you work towards the corners, you're going to get a big clump of stain in the corners. And to avoid that, I found it easier to work away from the corners. So start at the corner and work your way out. That way the stain doesn't clump. You get a dark spot in the corners. This step in the process really is the most time-consuming step in the whole process, but you'll want to spend the extra time in this step just so that you get the best possible look, because once you get this stain dried, that's what you're going to be looking at until you have to redo the door again. So you want to make sure you take the time and just work the stain to make it look how you want it to look. And I just continually work and work on the door until it gets exactly how I want it to be. And I'll just keep making wood grain strokes here to make it look like wood, real wood, which is the goal of the fiberglass door here, to make it look like it's a real wood door. And I'll just keep working it until I get the desired look. And then once I'm done, I'll let it dry for a 4-hour period, and you can see here the door is starting to dry, and I'm going to go ahead and start the polyurethane. Now I chose a good quality outdoor polyurethane with UV protection to protect it from the sunlight, and I'm going to go ahead and gently stir the polyurethane. You don't want to shake it to get the bubbles in there. You want to gently stir thoroughly the polyurethane. So to start out with, I'm going to go with the grain, and I'm going to use my foam brush on the flat surfaces of the door. And I'm just going to slowly work it in, make sure that I get everything covered, because this is going to protect my door from any scratches and the UV of the sun. The stain that I put on in the last step is just basically laying on top, so it could scratch very easily. The only thing protecting the stain from scratching off of the fiberglass door is this polyurethane, so I'm going to have to put 3 coats on. I'm going to use a brush here, in that just makes it easier to get into the corners, and I want to make sure that I don't pull the polyurethane in the corners. And as you can see here, I've got my first coat on the door. It looks pretty good. So I'm going to wait about 4 to 6 hours, and then I'm going to take a fine steel wool and go over the door gently, just to rough up the surface ever so slightly, and get ready for the second coat. And before I do the second coat, I'm going to take my tack cloth once again and wipe down the door. You can also again use an air compressor. So I'm going to go ahead and apply my second coat. This is going to require 3 coats, and in between each coat you're going to want to use your steel wool. I'm going to save my brush here. I'm going to put it in a Ziploc bag in between coats so that it doesn't dry out. I'll put it in a Ziploc bag and work all the air out of it. And you can put it in the refrigerator, and that'll keep your brush fresh for the next coat. Just kind of zip it up. It's not going to be completely airtight, but working the air out and putting it in the refrigerator will help get it ready. And after about 4 to 6 hours of dry time, I'm going to prep my door by using the steel wool for my final coat. And I'm going to use the air compressor to blow out the corners again. And then last but not least, I'm going to use my tack cloth just to make sure that I get a good quality finish. Then I can go ahead and put my final coat on. Now, remember, it's always better to put on thin coats, multiple thin coats. It's better to do that than put on one thick, heavy coat. So this is my third and final coat, so I want to make sure I get that really smooth, take my time and work all the polyurethane into the cracks. Once I get that done, I can go ahead and set the door back up on the hinges. Now I waited about 6 hours dry time so I could handle the door here, and it's easy enough to do. I just slide the door back up on there and push the hinge pins back in. And I'm going to leave the door open for a little while just to make sure that it's not sticking to the weather stripping around the door. I'd hate for it to pull my finish off. Just simply push the hinge pins back into their spot here, and I've got the door securely fastened back to the house. You can tap the hinge pins down in and secure all the hinge pins, all 3 hinge pins. Now that I'm ready, got my door hung, I'm going to go ahead and put my doorknob back on. Just put the doorknob back in the slot here, and there's 2 screws on either side. Line up the holes on the inside and the outside, and just tighten the screws. Once I get the doorknob tightened down, my next step is to put in the deadbolt, and I'm going to put this security sleeve in there and then put the deadbolt in from the outside. And I'm going to go around to the inside and line up my 2 holes here. Once I get those lined up, I can go ahead and put the 2 screws that will attach to the outside of the deadbolt. Next, I'm going to install my door knocker and peephole. And to do that, I just line up the peephole with the hole in the door, go around to the inside, and there's 2 mounting screws, one on the top, one on the bottom, that I have to install. Then I want to go ahead and screw the eyepiece in for the peephole, and that screws in from the inside. And then last piece of hardware I have to put on my door is my kick plate, and that just screws back in the way it was removed with the Phillips screws across the top and across the bottom. Now, as you can see here, the newly finished door looks so much better than it did before, and it should give me years of great service. This is How To Bob. Thanks for watching.